Edania. A brief, recent history. The year is 2136. Humanity is clinging to civilization by its fingertips. The debts of centuries of unchecked expansion, exploitation, and overconsumption have finally come due. Resource shortages led to endless proxy wars. Sea levels rose, and never stopped, outstripping the most pessimistic predictions to reach 50 feet above their historical baseline. Rising temperatures rendered entire countries virtually uninhabitable. Billions fled their homes, marching across continents to escape the dying world. The resulting wave of migrants put more fortunate countries under immense social and economic strain. Many collapsed. Many more closed their borders, turning to authoritarianism and militarism to preserve the stability needed to survive. A few exploited their neighbors' weaknesses, expanding their borders and founding powerful new states. Though the collapse left much of the world an apocalyptic waterland, a handful of nations maintained stability, becoming vibrant centers of technological progress and economic prosperity, often through the economic and political exploitation of weaker states. These countries, Edania among them, formed the League, a coalition of powerful, stable nations using brutal military force to stave off global collapse. While their battle against extremists, rebels, and rogue governments has helped prevent outright anarchy, the balance of power remains dangerously fragile. Edania, a small, prosperous, mercantile island nation, managed to weather the storm better than most. A stoic, practical people, Edanians valued self-reliance, maritime trade, and quiet competence, traits that served them well in the early decades of the climate apocalypse. Immigrants, especially skilled ones, were welcomed in with open arms, and the country's population and power grew. Successive liberal democratic government assured people that the situation was under control, while doing little to fix the root problems poisoning the planet. Things were not under control, however, and throughout the first half of the 21st century, the situation declined drastically. Sea levels continued to rise, at first slowly, later rapidly, swallowing up swathes of the country's coastline. The waves of migrants didn't abate, but only became worse as equatorial countries became too hot to survive in. Faced with collapsing neighbors and a deteriorating environment, the economy came under increasing strain. The half-hearted countermeasures of the laissez-faire democratic governments proved woefully inadequate to solve the nation's mounting issues. Blackouts became routine. Inflation gutted the middle class. With each storm season, another town vanished beneath the waves. In 2055, the economy collapsed entirely. Edanians found themselves rationing food, fleeing their homes, shuttering their businesses. Under these dire conditions, Edanians began to turn on their democratic and open society. Priority was placed on a return to stability and tradition. The Edania Progress Party, EPP, a political movement uniting the conservative establishment and corporatists, slowly gained traction with the public. In 2069, after years of civil strife, the EPP finally gained power under Clavian Rouster. Rouster's speeches promised dignity through order. He spoke in clipped, reassuring tones, promising a return to the disciplined practicality of Edania's past. Many found comfort in his cold precision. In the following years, Prime Minister Rouster orchestrated the slow death of the terminally ill Edanian democracy. Media outlets came under the control of the EPP's corporatist backers. Opposition parties were framed as threats to stability and were slowly suppressed. Political freedoms were strictly curtailed as the population was mobilized to fight against the nation's overwhelming issues. Within 10 years, Edania was essentially a one-party state. However, under the EPP's increasingly heavy hand, Edania was saved from the abyss. Political suppression quelled the instability and civil strife of the previous 30 years. Under Prime Minister Martin Harrows, massive infrastructure projects were launched to drag the nation back from collapse. A 400-mile seawall, the largest engineering project in Edanian history, saved the nation's capital and agricultural heartland from encroaching tides. To support the growing population, entire communities were relocated into cramped megacities, freeing up land for farming and flood control. The cost, social, economic, and human, was staggering. Entire towns were cleared. Their citizens were forced into the crowded streets of Blackpool, Ashcombe, and other urban centers. Professors and lawyers found themselves pouring concrete beside day laborers and ex-soldiers, their former lives erased in the face of new realities. To fund these efforts, Harrow's successors opened the floodgates to foreign and domestic corporations alike. Capital flooded into Blackpool, now a gleaming megacity swollen with glass towers and corporate ambition. In exchange, the government stripped away environmental regulations, labor protections, and civil rights. Injured workers were quietly disappeared, strikes were answered with private security raids, and entire industries ran on silent desperation. Immigrants were pushed to the margins, crammed into vertical slums the government refused to acknowledge. A rotating door of EPP prime ministers presided over a gilded age of corporate gluttony and authoritarian nationalism. As the years dragged on, discontent began to fester. People were no longer willing to scrape by. Native Edanians demanded the return of the rights and privileges they had forfeited during the crisis. Immigrants demanded an end to the party's discrimination and economic favoritism. Protests broke out across the country. Strikes shut down factories in Bromwich, and student marches filled the streets of Cross Hill with chants of "No more silence." Reformist politicians like Vernon Allister called for a return to constitutional rule. In 2115, a coordinated attack assassinated the prime minister and most of the cabinet, throwing the EPP into chaos. Bandon Riker, a young military protege in the Home Army, claimed responsibility and called for the end of one-party rule. Millions flocked to the banner of the Edanian Republican Army. With the government reeling, rebel forces seized large sections of several key cities. For the first time in decades, EPP broadcasts were interrupted, replaced by grainy footage of Riker calling for the birth of a second republic. For a brief moment, it seemed a new Edania might emerge. Allister and other civilian leaders formed a provisional council. Newspapers printed calls for reform. The old republic's banner flew again over Blackpool and Cavendish. Exiled intellectuals returned to Cross Hill. Civil servants openly defied party orders. Vernon Allister gave daily addresses, urging unity between civilian reformers and Riker's military command. Historians would later call it the False Spring. But the EPP was far from finished. Ryland Attlee, the only surviving cabinet member, assumed emergency powers. An administrative genius, he quickly rallied the military, the industrialists, and the party hardliners. Within weeks, corporate security forces were folded into the army, the Edanian Expeditionary Army was recalled, and the fronts stabilized. The nation divided in two. The civil war that followed was short and brutal. The Republican Army was crushed and driven out of the cities. Allister's council was dissolved. Riker and his forces went underground, beginning a 5-year insurgency marked by bombings, assassinations, and street warfare. In Harrowton and Weston, armored vehicles became a daily sight, and curfews were enforced with live ammunition. Then, 21 years ago, an accord was finally struck to end the war. Edanians were exhausted by years of fighting. With no potential for victory in sight, the rebels were finally ready to come to the table. General Riker denounced the agreement, calling it surrender, but the rest of the rebel leadership, led by Vernon Allister, signed the treaty. The Edanian Liberty Front, ELF, was born. In the elections that followed, they won several seats. General Riker disappeared. Allister, cautious and conciliatory, tried to present the ELF as a party of unity, but he was quickly boxed out, first by his former EPP colleagues, then by the more radical voices inside his own ranks. 6 years later, he died in an aerodyne crash, disgraced and politically forgotten. The new Prime Minister, Attlee, proved to be not only an able administrator, but the architect of a genuine economic revival. Northern Cavendish, once leveled by war, was reborn as the Blackpool Business District, a sprawl of gleaming corporate campuses, each crowned with a towering monolith of steel and glass. Between them, luxury high-rises and curated leisure zones house the white-collar elite in a world detached from the city beyond. Weston, pummeled during the war, was rebuilt in record time in a speculative building boom that transformed the district. Across the river, East Bank professionals found work again. For the first time in decades, a middle-class lifestyle was fully restored to native Edanians. Restrictions on the opposition were loosened. An uneasy optimism began. Yet real change never came. Inequality deepened. Corporate power tightened its grip on every level of government. The West Bank's sprawling gangs and militias have now united under a single boss, Milos Đurđević. The opposition has grown bold under ELF leader Sekuo Makonnen, a competent firebrand who delivered a sharp blow to the EPP in recent local elections. The stability of the country hangs once more in the balance.